Welcome back to Freedom Fridays. In this episode of Freedom Fridays, we're continuing our study through the book of Ephesians with a focus on spiritual growth, and we come to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 17. And we're getting very close to the end of the discussion of the armor of God. Depending on your translation and where they put the paragraph marks, either this is the last verse in the armor of God or the next section may be included as well. Verse 17 says, "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." And before we get into the helmet and the sword, there's an interesting distinction to be made here in the word take versus what he has in verse 13 and in other passages here. This is a different word. This word is more to be given and receive than to actually take up yourself. So when you talked about taking up the full armor of God in verse 13, putting it on in verse 14, doing the, shodding your feet in verse 15, taking up, again, same word as 13 in verse 16. This is a different word. This is, instead of you doing it, this is your receiving the helmet of salvation. So take the helmet of salvation. Notice it doesn't say take up. It just says take or receive and put on the helmet of salvation. That's because we don't earn the helmet of salvation. This is a gift from God. And so we receive the gift. We take the gift. And of course, the helmet of salvation is a reference to our salvation, which is a gift from God. And earlier in the book, he's been focusing on this. Now he's coming full circle as he's talking about the armor of God. Remember, this is God's armor, not ours. He is putting on the salvation for us. And just like it says in chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, that it's by grace that we're saved, not by works, because we boast about it, yet we still do works as a result, but the gift of salvation is by grace. It's by God's doing, not ours. This is not a new concept either. This helmet of salvation is not a new concept with Paul in Ephesians. If we go to Isaiah chapter 59, beginning halfway through verse 15, it says, "Now the Lord saw, and it was displeasing in his sight that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no one to intercede." So the situation is, there's no justice, there's no one to even call for justice. And so at the end of this verse, then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. God says, I'm going to just step in because no one is here to provide for justice. Verse 17, he put on righteousness like a breastplate, sound familiar? And a helmet of salvation on his head. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and he wrapped himself with zeal as a mantle, and he's going to then provide justice. This helmet of salvation is not saving himself, obviously. No one needs to save God. No one can harm God. So this helmet of salvation in Isaiah is he's providing salvation as justice. He's showing justice to the people and saving those who are being unjustly treated. And so again, salvation is a gift from God, even back in Isaiah chapter 59. We also see this idea of salvation in, or the helmet of salvation in First Thessalonians, where he talks about the helmet of salvation as well. And that brings us back here to Ephesians 6:17. Take or receive the helmet of salvation. Now, it's a helmet for a reason, because your head is arguably the most important part of your body. And yes, we joke about it. There are a lot of people who don't use it. So why is it so important? It's a joke. The helmet is very important. It's where you think. It's what controls your body. That's why Jesus is set up as the head of the body, as we talked about in Ephesians 5. So to guard the head is critical. You get a head blow, you're done. And so the salvation from the Lord guards our head, which is where we think. It's where we make decisions. It's where we make choices. It's what we know. And it's our understanding. And it directs the whole of our body. And so the whole of our body should be directed by our salvation. Why? Because we now are no longer bound in sin, but are a new creation. Old things have passed away. All things have become new because of this salvation, which should guard what controls your life, your will, your desires, your thoughts. All should be controlled by the fact of your salvation, if indeed you have salvation and have received salvation from Jesus Christ. You can go back and listen to the very first podcast in season 1 if you would like to know more about how to receive salvation. And then the second half of this verse says, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. So he tells us exactly what the sword is. This sword, now remember, what is our purpose for this armor? Our purpose is to stand. Remember? Take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist, going all the way back up, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. That's our goal. Stand. Resist. Stand. That's our goal. Our goal is to, and having done everything, verse 13, to stand firm in our faith. Not be rocked by the things of the devil, not be rocked by the things of the enemy, but instead to stand. Remember, our goal is not to take out the devil. That is way above yours and my pay grade. That is way above yours and my ability. Even the Archangel Michael, as it says in Jude, would not dare to argue toe-to-toe with Satan, even though he was just as strong. And he still didn't dare to go toe-to-toe, but said, the Lord rebuke you. So remember, don't get arrogant and think, I'm going to grab the Word of God and I'm going to slice and dice the devil. That's not what it's for us. It is so that we can stand firm in our faith. Now remember, even in the imagery of a soldier with all of this armor on, the sword is not only offensive, but it is defensive as well. And we do use it in an offensive manner, but not against our enemy, where we're going to take him out as much as we're going to deter him from attacking. as well as being able to use the sword to block his attacks. We see Jesus doing this, and we're going to get to that in a little bit. When he was tempted by Satan. But let's take a look also at this imagery of the sword. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 12 says, "For the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, and piercing as far as the division of the soul and spirit, both joints and marrow, and able to judge the thoughts and intentions of the heart." That's what this sword is like. This is sharper than any double-edged sword. It's able to do the impossible, splitting between soul and spirit. That's not something that can be done for us, but the Word of God can. And it goes right to the intentions of the heart. Now, what are we using it for? Remember, we're using it to stand. So it's actually going to the intentions and thoughts of my own heart. I'm not worried about convicting the heart of the devil. His fate is sealed. This is going to the thoughts and intentions of my own heart surgery, so that my heart is completely and utterly devoted to God, so that I can stand. It gets out all of the garbage in my life, all of the sin in my life, all of the defects in my life. It goes all the way to the thoughts and intentions in my life. Why do I do what I do? And sometimes when we ask people, why did you do that? They say, well, I don't know. And potentially maybe that's true. However, when we dig into the Word of God reveals those purposes, those thoughts, those intentions. So as we are in the Word of God more and we think about, oh, that's why I do those things. James tells me why I quarrel and why I fight with people. It's because of my own selfish desires. It's not just I don't know. There's an actual reason that the Word of God tells us. So that is the sword of the Spirit that we're talking about. This sword is also, get this is a pretty cool picture, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 12, "Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the middle of the 7 lampstands, I saw one like a son of man." This is a picture of Jesus. He's the one who was just talking to him. "Clothed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, and when it has been made to glow in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in its strength." The two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, which is also mentioned in chapter 2 when he identifies himself as the one with the two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Now, what is the significance of a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth? Ephesians 6:17, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Jesus is the second member of the Trinity. He is God, and this sword comes out of his mouth because it's his word. It is his word. In fact, to prove that, take a look at chapter 19 of Revelation. We've got Jesus coming, verse 15, from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations. And we see he has on his thigh, he has written King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he kills everybody with the sword out of his mouth, the word of God. His words created the world. His words will destroy the enemies here. And his word is very powerful, as it said in Hebrews chapter 4. Speaking of chapter 4, let's go to Matthew chapter 4. This is a record of the temptation of Jesus, where Satan tempted Jesus. And verse 3, and the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones become bread. Command that these stones become bread. Because Jesus was hungry. It had already been 40 days and 40 nights that he was in the wilderness with no food. And so Satan saw his opportunity, and Jesus responds with this. But he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Now there's a couple meanings here for us. He's quoting, first of all, from Deuteronomy, which is the word of God. And he says, I don't need to listen to what your thoughts are, your ideas are of how I should live, because according to Deuteronomy, it says, I don't live by bread. I live by every mouth that comes out of, or every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Again, the word of God, the sharp double-edged sword, out of the mouth of Jesus. That's the other picture here. Every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. That's the double-edged sword. That is the word of God. And so Jesus, 3 times that are recorded of temptation, and all 3 times he pulls out the sword. And he doesn't slice and dice Satan. Satan does flee because he realizes this is pointless. There is no end to this. He's not going to turn. He's going to stand because he's got his armor on. And he grabbed to defend himself. Again, not the shield. He grabbed the sword. He grabbed the sword on the end. On the other hand, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Verse 7 and verse 10, he goes out again. The devil pulls out the word of God, and he says, no, you took it out of context in verse 7. And then in verse 10, he tells him to leave, and he says, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. This is the sword of the Spirit. The more you know of the Word of God, the more equipped you will be to stand when the devil's arrows start flying. The more equipped you will be to not only stand, but not be injured. To just be more impervious to his attacks because you know the shield of faith. You know what the Word of God says, so you're combining the shield with the sword because your shield is based upon what you know from the sword. This whole thing works together. The Word of God is quick and powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword, and can cut out all the garbage in our lives. So make sure you receive that helmet of salvation, and that you make sure that you are using the Word of God properly and are studying and are in the Word of God. Well, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. on Freedom Fridays.